Captain James Hartwell leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the infinite darkness beyond the cockpit of the Endeavour. The vessel hummed quietly as it glided through the cold expanse of the Orpheus Galaxy, far from Earth and farther still from any known civilization. His mission was routine, scouting potential habitable planets for Earth's rapidly expanding colonies. But after months of isolation, everything had become a monotonous blur of distant stars and unremarkable worlds. Just as James was about to settle into another quiet evening of solitude, a faint beep echoed through the control console. His heart rate quickened as he leaned forward, the worn leather of his seat creaking beneath him. The source of the signal was odd. It wasn't one of the usual automated planetary beacons or the generic chatter from other survey ships. This was a distress signal. James adjusted the communication frequencies, trying to clear up the static. The message was scrambled and barely discernible, but the coordinates that accompanied it were unmistakable. Sector 17, a forbidden and uncharted region of space. He paused for a moment, instinctively cautious. Sector 17 was a place shrouded in rumor and secrecy. No one went there, and no one ever spoke of why. Curiosity gnawed at him, and despite his better judgment, he couldn't turn away. If someone was in trouble out there, stranded in that desolate corner of the galaxy, it was his duty to respond. The Council might have blacklisted the area, but the faint desperation in the signal tugged at him. He couldn't just ignore it. "Computer, chart a course to the source of the signal," James ordered. As the ship began to shift its trajectory, James felt a subtle unease settle in his chest. He had no idea what awaited him in Sector 17, but his gut told him this was no ordinary distress call. Something about it felt personal. The journey to the coordinates was quiet, too quiet. The ship's scanners picked up no signs of debris, no active vessels, and no planetary bodies close enough to be the origin of the signal. Hours passed, and the void grew more oppressive, as if the very fabric of space wanted to swallow him whole. Finally, his ship's sensors alerted him to a nearby moon. The surface was barren, its landscape jagged and hostile, with a toxic atmosphere that barely registered as breathable. Yet there it was, a tiny signal emanating from a shallow crater, faint but undeniable. James landed the Endeavour on the rocky surface, his ship's landing gear creaking as it made contact with the uneven ground. The moment his boots hit the dirt, he felt a strange pull. The air, thin and bitter, carried an eerie silence, broken only by the hum of his oxygen mask. The desolation of this place seeped into his bones as he made his way toward the source of the signal. Ahead of him, built into the jagged rock formations, was a small structure, no more than a cave with a few metallic reinforcements. The entrance was barely visible under layers of dust and rock, as if it had been long forgotten by the galaxy at large. With a sharp hiss, the door creaked open, and James stepped inside. The dim light from James's handheld beacon revealed a cramped, makeshift shelter. The walls were lined with cracked panels and scattered debris, evidence of long-term neglect. But amid the desolation, something, or rather, someone, lay huddled on the far side of the room, cloaked in shadow. James approached cautiously, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm, just in case. As he drew closer, the figure shifted slightly, stirring from a restless slumber. He could now make out her features, pale skin tinged with a faint, unnatural glow, silver veins pulsing beneath her flesh. Her hair was dark, streaked with silver strands that caught the dim light, and her eyes, half-lidded and weary, were a mesmerizing shade of violet, alien and yet familiar. She was weak, emaciated, as if she hadn't seen food or sunlight in weeks. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. James crouched beside her, unsure if she was even aware of his presence. "Hey," he said softly, his voice low but firm. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, barely focusing on him. She nodded weakly, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came. James quickly scanned the room, finding an old, half-functional medical kit near the door. He grabbed it and returned to her side, administering a hydration pack and a quick dose of emergency nutrients. After a few moments, she seemed to regain some strength, enough to sit up against the wall. Her gaze, though still clouded with exhaustion, held a strange intensity as it met his. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice cracked and hoarse, yet carrying an unearthly resonance. "Funny," James replied, injecting a note of dry humor into his voice. I was about to say the same thing to you. What the hell happened? Who are you? She hesitated, her expression tightening as if weighing whether to trust him. After a long silence, she spoke again, her words deliberate. My name is Serena, she began, her voice growing steadier. And I've been exiled by the Galactic Council. James blinked, caught off guard by the gravity of her words. The Council only exiled the most dangerous criminals, people who threatened the balance of the galaxy. But this woman, while clearly of alien descent, seemed frail, vulnerable. How could she be dangerous? Exiled? For what? Her violet eyes darkened, her gaze distant, as though recalling a painful memory. For being born. I am half Valerian, half human. They fear me for what I am, for what I could become. James felt a cold chill run down his spine. Valerians were a powerful, enigmatic species known for their advanced energy manipulation, a skill that made them both feared and revered. If she truly was half Valerian, that alone could explain why the Council might see her as a threat. And you've been here, alone this whole time? He asked, his voice softer now. For years, Serena whispered, forgotten, left to die in the shadows of this forsaken moon. Her words hung heavy in the stale air. James could see the toll it had taken on her, physically, mentally, emotionally. She had been cast aside by a galaxy too afraid of her potential, exiled for something she had no control over. And now, against all odds, here she was, still clinging to life. I won't leave you here, James said, his decision resolute. We're getting out of this place. For the first time, a flicker of hope crossed Serena's face, but it was quickly tempered by a grim realization. You don't understand. If you help me, they'll come for you too. The Council, they won't let either of us go. James stood, determination hardening his features. Let them come. I've faced worse than the Council. I'm not abandoning you here. Serena looked up at him, and for the first time in years, her heart stirred with something she thought long forgotten. Hope. Then let's go, she whispered, before they find us. Without another word, James helped her to her feet, and together they made their way out of the desolate shelter, towards the waiting Endeavor. The storm was coming, but for the first time, neither of them would face it alone. The Endeavor rumbled softly as it broke through the thin atmosphere of the barren moon. Inside, James kept a close eye on Serena, who sat slumped in the co-pilot's chair, her energy waning from the exertion of walking to the ship. Her violet eyes darted between the control panels and the vast blackness of space beyond the cockpit window, a mix of apprehension and disbelief clear on her face. James stole a glance at her as the ship ascended, wondering what could have possibly led the Galactic Council to abandon someone like her. The Valerians were known for their abilities to manipulate energy, but Serena didn't seem like the dangerous weapon they had feared. She was fragile, human even, in ways that made his heart ache. I still don't understand, James said after a long silence, his voice low but firm. Why exile you? What makes you so dangerous? Serena exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting out toward the stars as if the answer was somewhere out there. She ran her fingers absently over her forearm, where faint, glowing lines of energy pulsed just beneath her skin. It's not just what I am, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. It's what I could become. The Council doesn't tolerate anything they can't control, and hybrids like me were unpredictable, dangerous even to them. James frowned, his brow furrowing as he absorbed her words. But you don't seem dangerous. You're just different. Serena turned her gaze to him, her violet eyes piercing through the shadows of the cockpit. That's the problem. Different terrifies them. My father was Valerian, my mother human, a union forbidden by both species. I was born with powers they don't fully understand. Neither do I, for that matter. But the Council, they saw me as a threat from the moment I was born. They gave me no choice. Either live in their custody for the rest of my life or be cast out. James shook his head, anger simmering beneath the surface. So they sent you here to die. Serena gave a bitter laugh. Not officially, of course. They called it protective exile. I was supposed to stay in isolation until they deemed it safe for me to return, but we both know they never intended to let me out. James's jaw clenched. The Galactic Council, the supposed protectors of peace and order in the galaxy, had cast her away like a piece of discarded refuse. The thought disgusted him. Well, he said, voice hardening, They don't get to make that call anymore. I'm getting you out of here. But even as the words left his lips, James knew this was no simple rescue mission. He had defied council law the moment he entered Sector 17. Taking Serena with him would make them both fugitives. The council's influence stretched across the galaxy, and they would hunt them both relentlessly if they discovered what he had done. Serena looked at him with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. You're risking your life for someone you don't even know. James met her gaze, unwavering. No one deserves to be abandoned like that. Least of all someone who's done nothing wrong. Besides, I've got a knack for surviving impossible odds. She smiled faintly, the first glimmer of warmth he had seen in her expression. It was fleeting, but it made something stir inside him. He was committed now, consequences be damned. As the Endeavor soared through the emptiness of space, Serena closed her eyes, her breathing slow and measured. James watched her for a moment before turning his focus to the navigation controls. The safest option would be to hide, to lay low in one of the outer systems until he could figure out a more permanent solution. But hiding was easier said than done when you were up against an intergalactic government. Set a course for the Carina Nebula, James muttered to himself, keying in the coordinates. It was one of the more remote regions of the galaxy, far from council patrols, and the dense gas clouds would help mask their ship from sensors. Serena stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open. Carina Nebula? That's ambitious. James raised an eyebrow. Ambitious is just another word for smart when you're outnumbered. We'll be safe there, at least for a while. Serena nodded, though her expression remained troubled. I don't want you to get caught in this because of me. If they find out you've helped an exile, they'll come after you too. James shrugged, his lips curving into a smirk. Let them. I've been outrunning trouble for most of my life. The council won't be any different. But Serena didn't seem reassured. The weight of her exile, of her identity, lingered in her expression. As much as James tried to make light of the danger, he could see the fear in her eyes. The fear that she would bring ruin to anyone who dared to help her. Still, the quiet determination in her gaze told him she wouldn't give up so easily. Not now. Not after he had saved her. The stars stretched out before them, distant and unfeeling, as the Endeavor sped toward its uncertain future. As the Endeavor crossed into the outer rim of Sector 17, James's fingers danced over the control panel, rerouting power to the stealth systems. He couldn't afford to be detected now, not with council patrols sweeping through the adjacent sectors. Their window of escape was narrow, and one wrong move could alert the authorities to their presence. Serena sat quietly beside him, her fingers tracing the faint glow of her skin. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a constant reminder of the power that coursed through her veins. Her eyes were distant, as if her mind was elsewhere, wandering through memories she didn't want to revisit. Are you sure you're ready for this? James asked, breaking the silence. Serena turned to him, her expression unreadable. I don't have a choice, do I? You've given me a chance, and I won't waste it. James nodded, though he could sense the tension in her voice. She wasn't just running from the council, she was running from herself, from the fear of what she might become. We'll be fine, he said, more to reassure himself than her. We just need to get past the outer patrols. Once we're out of Sector 17, it's smoother sailing. I've got contacts in the outer colonies. They can help us lay low for a while. Serena studied him, her gaze penetrating. You really believe that, don't you? That we can outrun them? James grinned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm an optimist. Suddenly the ship's alarms blared, jolting both of them out of their thoughts. James cursed under his breath as the ship's sensors picked up an approaching council patrol. They had crossed into the fringe of council territory, and it hadn't taken long for someone to notice their presence. Looks like we've got company, James muttered, adjusting the ship's course. Hold on tight. This could get rough. Serena's eyes narrowed, her hands gripping the armrests of her seat as the Endeavor lurched forward, picking up speed. The patrol ships were closing in fast, their sleek designs built for pursuit. James had hoped to avoid this kind of confrontation, but it seemed luck wasn't on their side. The ship rattled as laser fire streaked past them, barely missing the hull. James's hands moved swiftly over the controls, rerouting power to the engines and boosting their speed. He darted between asteroid clusters, weaving through the debris in an effort to shake their pursuers. Serena watched in silence, her violet eyes wide with tension, but beneath the surface, her mind was racing. She could feel the hum of energy beneath her skin, the power that had always frightened her. But now, in this moment, she felt something different, an urge to protect, to fight back. Without warning, Serena closed her eyes, her breathing steadying as she reached out with her mind. James glanced at her, confused. "What are you?" Before he could finish, the air inside the cockpit shifted. The glow beneath Serena's skin intensified, and for a split second, James thought he saw a ripple of energy pass through the ship's systems. Suddenly, the approaching patrol ships veered off course, their movements erratic as if something had interfered with their navigation. "What the hell?" James muttered, eyes wide as he watched the ships struggle to regain control. Serena opened her eyes, a slight tremor in her hands as the glow faded. I disrupted their guidance systems. It won't last long, but it'll buy us some time." James stared at her, both impressed and slightly unnerved. "You can do that?" Serena's expression was conflicted, a mixture of fear and resolve. "I didn't know if I could, but I had to try." James let out a breath, shaking his head. "Remind me not to underestimate you." With the patrol ships momentarily disabled, James pushed the Endeavour to full speed, breaking through the edge of Sector 17. The stars blurred around them as they shot into open space, the patrols fading behind them. For now, they were free. But both of them knew it wouldn't last. As the ship raced toward the relative safety of the Carina Nebula, James glanced at Serena, his mind racing with questions he wasn't ready to ask. She had saved them. But at what cost? And what would happen the next time the Council came after them? One thing was certain, Serena was far more powerful than either of them had realized, and her abilities would only grow stronger. James gripped the controls tightly, knowing that their escape had only just begun. The Endeavour drifted through the swirling gas clouds of the Carina Nebula, the vibrant hues of cosmic dust creating a kaleidoscope of colors outside the cockpit. It was beautiful, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere inside the ship. James leaned back in his seat, eyes focused on the distant stars, but his mind was firmly anchored on the present. And the woman beside him. Serena sat quietly, her slender fingers tracing the subtle glow that still pulsed beneath her skin. She hadn't spoken much since their daring escape, her violet eyes distant as if lost in thought. James had tried to shake the memory of how she had disrupted the Council ships, but he couldn't. It had been effortless for her, almost instinctual. Yet there was fear in her eyes every time she used her powers, as if she were terrified of what she could do. "We'll need to lay low for a while," James said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but the undercurrent of tension was undeniable. "The Council's going to be looking for us, and they'll send more than just patrols next time." Serena nodded but didn't respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the nebula outside. "I know," she finally said, her voice soft, almost resigned. "They always find a way. They have eyes everywhere." "Not out here they don't," James countered. "The nebula's dense enough to mask us for a while. I've got a contact in the Helios system, someone who owes me a few favors. We can hide there until we figure out our next move." Serena turned to him, her expression unreadable. "And then what? We just run forever?" James exhaled, his hands gripping the controls tightly. "I don't have all the answers, Serena, but I'm not about to let them take you back. Whatever it takes, we'll find a way to survive." She studied him for a moment, her eyes softening slightly. "You don't even know me. Why are you doing this?" James paused, searching for the right words. He had asked himself the same question more than once since finding her. Why risk everything for someone he'd just met? Someone who was, by all accounts, a fugitive of the most powerful organization in the galaxy? "I know what it feels like to be alone," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "To be on the run, not knowing who you can trust. I've been there, and you don't deserve to be abandoned like that. No one does." Serena's gaze lingered on him, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her expression. Gratitude, maybe, or something deeper. But before she could say anything, the ship's alarm blared. James shot up, his fingers flying over the control panel. "Damn it," We've been tracked. Serena's eyes widened, and she stood quickly, looking over his shoulder at the display. How? The nebula should have masked us? James's jaw clenched. Looks like they've upgraded their tracking tech. They're not messing around this time. Outside, through the swirling clouds of the nebula, 3 sleek Council warships emerged, their engines glowing menacingly as they closed in on the Endeavor. James's heart raced. The patrol ships they had faced earlier were nothing compared to these heavily armed vessels. If they didn't act fast, they wouldn't stand a chance. Serena's face paled, and she took a step back, her hands trembling. We can't outrun them. James's mind raced, calculating their options. There weren't many. We don't need to outrun them, he muttered. We just need to outsmart them. Without hesitation, he initiated evasive maneuvers, pushing the ship's engines to their limit as they weaved through the nebula's dense clouds. The Council ships followed, their laser cannons lighting up the nebula with fiery bursts as they tried to lock on to the Endeavor. Serena gripped the back of his seat, her breath shallow. I can try to disrupt their systems again. James glanced at her, his voice firm. No, not this time. It's too risky, and I'm not losing you to another blackout. But, no. His voice was sharper than he intended, but he couldn't afford to let her put herself in danger again. Not like this. The ship rattled violently as a laser blast skimmed their hull, sparks flying from the control panel. James cursed under his breath. They couldn't take much more of this. Suddenly, an idea struck him. Hold on, he said, gritting his teeth. This is gonna get rough. Without warning, James steered the Endeavor into a steep dive, plunging deeper into the nebula's thickest clouds. The Council ships hesitated, their sensors struggling to keep up with the shifting environment. James pushed the engines harder, driving the ship into a narrow crevice in a nearby asteroid field. The warships followed, but their bulkier frames made it difficult to navigate the tight spaces. James zigzagged through the asteroid field with practiced precision, dodging rocks and debris as laser fire erupted behind them. One of the Council ships miscalculated, slamming into an asteroid with a deafening explosion. James didn't give them a chance to recover. He looped the ship around a large asteroid, cutting power to the engines for a brief moment to let them drift silently behind the cover of space debris. The remaining warships flew past, their sensors unable to detect the Endeavor in the chaos. For several long moments, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, James re-engaged the engines and pulled the ship away from the asteroid field, his heart still pounding in his chest. They're gone, he muttered, more to himself than to Serena. For now, at least. Serena collapsed into the co-pilot's chair, her body trembling with adrenaline. That was, I thought. James let out a shaky breath, turning to her with a small, tired smile. I told you, I'm good at surviving impossible odds. The Endeavor emerged from the Carina Nebula battered but still functional. James had managed to outmaneuver the Council's warships, but he knew their luck was running thin. Every moment they spent in open space increased the risk of being found again. The Council wasn't going to give up easily, not after this. They were outlaws now, both of them. James glanced at Serena, who sat quietly in the co-pilot's chair, her fingers still trembling from the close call. She was strong, stronger than she realized, but the weight of her exile and the Council's relentless pursuit was taking its toll. We can't keep running forever, Serena said softly, her voice laced with exhaustion. They'll find us again, sooner or later. James nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. She was right. Running wasn't a long-term solution, but what other choice did they have? The Council had resources, technology, and the law on their side. They were just 2 people in a galaxy that had already decided they didn't belong. I have a few contacts in the outer systems, James said, his voice steady. People who live off the grid. They might be able to help us disappear for a while. Serena turned to him, her violet eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. Disappear? What kind of life is that? Constantly looking over our shoulders, never staying in one place for too long. Is that what we're running toward? James's expression hardened. It's survival, Serena. It's better than the alternative. She looked down, her hands resting on her lap. I don't want to drag you into this any more than I already have. James reached over, placing a hand on hers. You're not dragging me into anything. I made my choice the moment I found you. I'm in this with you, whether you like it or not." Serena's eyes softened, and for the first time in days she smiled, just a faint, fleeting smile, but it was enough to stir something inside James. But before the moment could deepen, the ship's communication console beeped. James frowned, his hand moving to the controls. "Incoming transmission?" He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether it was a trap, but then he recognized the encryption, a signal he hadn't seen in years. It was from one of his old contacts, someone he hadn't expected to hear from again. "Hold on," James muttered as he opened the channel. "This could be interesting." A holographic image flickered to life above the console, revealing a rugged man with a scar across his cheek and a sly grin on his face. "Hartwell, it's been a while," James smirked. "Terran, didn't think I'd ever hear from you again." Terran chuckled, leaning back in his seat. "You're in a bit of trouble, I hear." "Got yourself on the wrong side of the council." James raised an eyebrow. "Word travels fast." "Faster than you think," Terran replied, his grin widening. "But don't worry, I've got a proposition for you, a way out if you're interested." James leaned forward, intrigued. "I'm listening." Terran's eyes flickered to Serena, his grin fading slightly. "But it's not just you they're after, is it? You've got a passenger who's got the council real spooked." James glanced at Serena, his jaw tightening. "She's with me. Whatever deal you've got, it's for both of us." Terran nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Fair enough. Meet me at the Zenith outpost in the Clyro system. We'll talk details there." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving James and Serena in tense silence. "What do you think?" Serena asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. James exhaled, his mind already calculating the risks. Terran wasn't someone he fully trusted, but he was resourceful. If there was a way out, Terran might have it. "I think," James said slowly, "we don't have a choice." Serena nodded, her gaze steady. "Then let's go." With a final glance at the stars outside, James set a course for the Clyro system. Whatever waited for them there, it was better than the endless chase. For now, they were still running, but at least they were running together. The Endeavour glided through the dark expanse of space, the faint glow of distant stars casting long shadows across the cockpit. James sat at the controls, his mind heavy with the weight of their journey. They were approaching the Zenith outpost in the Clyro system, where Terran promised a solution, but the unknowns gnawed at him. Terran was a wild card, a smuggler and opportunist who'd do anything for the right price. Trusting him wasn't something James did easily. Serena sat in the co-pilot's seat, her body still and quiet, but James could feel her unease in the air between them. She had become more reserved since the last encounter with the council ships, her silence carrying an edge that unsettled him. "Serena," James began, breaking the long, tense silence. "We're almost at the outpost. I don't trust Terran completely, but he might be our best shot at figuring this out." Serena's violet eyes remained fixed on the stars outside, her expression distant. "I know, but it's not him I'm worried about." James frowned. "Then what is it?" For a moment, she said nothing, as if debating whether to reveal her thoughts. Finally, she turned to face him, her eyes heavy with unspoken fears. "Everything," she whispered, her voice soft but loaded with emotion. "It's all too much. I don't even know who I am anymore." James felt his chest tighten at the raw vulnerability in her voice. He had seen her strength, her powers, the way she could manipulate energy like it was an extension of herself, but behind that power was a woman grappling with her identity. She was caught between two worlds, human and Valerian, neither accepting her, both rejecting her. "You're Serena," James said gently. "No matter what anyone else says, no matter what the council thinks, they don't define you." Serena shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "That's the problem, James. I don't even know what I am. I've spent so long hiding from myself, terrified of what I could become. And now, I'm afraid, not of the council, not of being hunted, but of me." James's heart ached at her words. He understood fear. He had lived through his own battles, made his own sacrifices, but this was different. Serena was afraid of her own power, afraid of losing control over something that had been part of her since birth. "You've done nothing wrong," James said, his voice steady. "You saved us back there. You've kept yourself alive for this long. That takes strength, Serena. The kind of strength most people can only dream of." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, her gaze softening as she looked at him. But what if it's not enough? What if I lose control one day? I could hurt you. I could destroy everything around me. James leaned closer, his eyes locking with hers. You won't. I believe in you, and I'm not going anywhere. For a long moment, Serena didn't speak. She simply stared at him, the fear and vulnerability warring with something else, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Trust. It was fragile, and yet in James's eyes, she saw it reflected back at her. Slowly, she reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on his. You've risked everything to save me. Why? Why do you care so much? James hesitated, the words catching in his throat. The truth was, he didn't know how to explain the connection he felt to her. It went beyond duty or morality. There was something about Serena that had drawn him in from the moment he found her on that desolate moon. Something deeper, more profound. I guess, he began, searching for the right words. I care, because I see you, Serena. Not what the council sees, not what they're afraid of, just you. And I want to make sure you have a future where you don't have to be afraid anymore. A tear slid down Serena's cheek, and she squeezed his hand gently. Thank you, James, for everything. James felt the tension in the air between them shift, the unspoken emotions simmering just beneath the surface. In that moment, he realized something had changed between them. They weren't just allies on the run anymore. They were connected by something far more powerful. Always, he whispered. But before either of them could say more, the proximity alarm blared, jerking them out of the moment. The Zenith outpost loomed ahead, its sprawl of interconnected docking bays and dilapidated stations casting a harsh shadow across the stars. James released her hand, his focus snapping back to the mission at hand. We're here. Time to see what Terran's got for us. Serena wiped the tear from her cheek, her face hardening once more as she prepared for whatever came next. But something had shifted between them, something that neither of them could deny. James docked the Endeavour in one of the outer bays of the Zenith outpost. The station was exactly as he remembered, chaotic, lawless, and teeming with the kind of people who made a living by skirting the edges of legality. It wasn't a place for honest deals, but it was perfect for those like him and Serena, people who needed to disappear. Terran was waiting for them when they stepped off the ship. The grizzled smuggler leaned against a stack of crates, his scarred face splitting into a wide grin as they approached. "Part well?" he called, his voice rough but filled with amusement. "You've got a real talent for making trouble, don't you?" James gave a curt nod. "Comes with the territory. You said you had a way out for us?" Terran's grin widened. "Straight to business. I like that. Yeah, I've got something lined up for you, but it's gonna cost." "How much?" James asked, his voice tight. He'd expected this. Terran waved a hand dismissively. "Relax, Hartwell. I'm not talking credits. I need something a little more personal." James's eyes narrowed. "What kind of favor?" Terran's gaze flickered to Serena, then back to James. "There's a shipment coming through Nebula 6 in a few hours. It's valuable, and I've got some buyers lined up who'll pay top dollar for it. I need you to make sure it gets through safely. In return, I'll get you and your lady friend off the council's radar." James exchanged a glance with Serena. Her face was unreadable, but he could sense her unease. This wasn't a simple favor. Smuggling in Nebula 6 was dangerous, and if the council had any presence there, they would be walking into a trap. "And what exactly are we protecting?" James asked, his voice skeptical. Terran shrugged, his grin never wavering. "Nothing you need to worry about. Just a little contraband." James didn't trust him, but they had no other options. They were running out of places to hide, and Terran's offer was their best shot at slipping off the council's grid. "Fine," James said, his voice firm. "We'll do it." Terran clapped his hands together, clearly pleased. "Knew I could count on you, Hartwell. I'll send the coordinates to your ship. Don't be late." As they walked back to the Endeavour, Serena spoke, her voice low and filled with concern. "You don't trust him, do you?" James shook his head. "Not for a second, but if this gets us out of here, it's worth the risk." Serena nodded, but the tension between them lingered. She could feel it, the danger, the uncertainty, and something else, something darker. Nebula 6 was a swirling storm of gas and debris, a perfect hiding spot for smugglers and outlaws. James guided the Endeavour into position, his senses on high alert. Taran's shipment was supposed to arrive soon, and they needed to be ready. But as the minutes ticked by, a cold dread settled in James's stomach. Something wasn't right. "James," Serena said suddenly, her voice sharp, "I'm picking up multiple signals. They're closing in fast." James's heart sank. Damn it, it's a trap. Before he could react, a squadron of Council interceptors emerged from the gas clouds, their weapons locked on the Endeavor. Laser fire streaked toward them, lighting up the nebula in a deadly blaze. "Hang on!" James shouted, jerking the ship into a steep dive. He swerved through the dense clouds, trying to shake the interceptors, but there were too many. They were surrounded. Serena's eyes blazed with determination, her hands gripping the armrests of her seat. "We have to fight back," James cursed under his breath. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they couldn't outrun the Council forever. "Do it." Serena closed her eyes, the energy within her surging. The air around them crackled with power as she reached out with her mind, manipulating the flow of energy around the Council ships. Suddenly, two of the interceptors veered off course, their systems malfunctioning under Serena's influence. But the others pressed on, their weapons firing relentlessly. "We can't hold them off," James shouted, his voice strained as the ship took another hit. But Serena wasn't done. Her eyes snapped open, glowing with an intensity James had never seen before. She raised her hands, and a massive pulse of energy erupted from her, rippling through the nebula like a shockwave. The remaining interceptors were caught in the blast, their systems short-circuiting as they spun out of control. For a moment, there was only silence. James let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he brought the ship under control. You did it." Serena slumped back in her seat, her breath shallow. "I didn't know if I could, but we had no choice." James reached over, placing a hand on her arm. "You saved us again." She looked at him, her violet eyes filled with exhaustion, but also a quiet determination. "I won't let them take me. Not again." As they flew out of Nebula 6, leaving the wreckage of the interceptors behind, James knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a chase anymore. It was a war, and they were in it together. The Endeavor limped through the vast reaches of the outer rim, its hull scarred and its systems barely functioning after the ambush at Nebula 6. James Hartwell stared out into the stars, exhaustion weighing heavy on him. The recent battle had pushed them both to their limits, and though they had narrowly escaped, they couldn't keep running forever. Supplies were running low, and Serena had expended an immense amount of energy defending them from the Council ships. She needed time to recover, and they needed somewhere to lay low. James checked the navigational charts, eyes narrowing as he considered their next move. There was only one place left that might offer them sanctuary, the remote sector controlled by the Zenith Alliance. It was a gamble. The Alliance wasn't known for being particularly welcoming, but they had one thing going for them. They hated the Galactic Council. "Serena," James called softly, turning his gaze to the back of the cockpit. She lay in a makeshift cot, her breathing steady but shallow, still recovering from the immense strain of the last fight. She stirred at his voice, her violet eyes blinking open. "We're heading to the Zenith Alliance's territory," James said, his voice low. "It's the only place left where we might get some help." Serena sat up slowly, her face pale but determined. "The Zenith Alliance? They're rebels. They'll never trust us." James shrugged, a half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "They might, once they hear our story. Besides, they're no friends of the Council. If anyone can hide us, it's them." Serena's eyes flickered with uncertainty. She had lived in isolation for so long, hunted by a government that feared her very existence. Trusting anyone felt foreign to her. But after everything they had been through, there was no other choice. "All right," she whispered, her voice stronger now. "Let's do it." James nodded, setting the course. The Endeavor groaned as it sped toward the outer edges of Zenith space, its systems held together by little more than grit and determination. The stars around them seemed to stretch on forever, a cold and empty expanse that mirrored the uncertainty they both felt. As they approached the Zenith-controlled sector, James sent a coded transmission to the Alliance outpost, hoping for a response. Minutes ticked by in tense silence before the ship's comms crackled to life. "Unidentified vessel, this is Zenith Command. You're entering restricted space. State your purpose, or be fired upon." James keyed the comm, his voice calm but authoritative. "This is Captain James Hartwell of the Endeavour. I'm here seeking asylum for myself and my passenger. We're fugitives of the Galactic Council. We have information that could be of value to the Alliance." A long silence followed, the tension thick in the air. James's heart pounded in his chest. If the Alliance didn't believe them, or worse, saw them as a threat, they would be dead before they could even blink. Finally, a voice crackled through the comm. "Captain Hartwell, stand by. We're sending a boarding party to escort you to the station. Any sign of resistance, and we'll destroy your ship." James exhaled in relief. Understood. The Zenith outpost loomed ahead, a sprawling network of interconnected stations and military hubs, far more sophisticated than James had expected. The Alliance was clearly more than just a band of rebels. They were an organized force, and if the Council had underestimated them, it was a mistake they would regret. As the Endeavour docked, a team of armed soldiers greeted them, their uniforms marked with the silver insignia of the Zenith Alliance. James and Serena disembarked cautiously, their hands raised in a gesture of peace. The lead soldier, a tall woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, stepped forward. "Captain Hartwell," she said, her tone clipped and professional. "I'm Commander Alira of the Zenith Alliance. You claim to have valuable information. We'll see if that's true soon enough." James nodded. "I understand, but first, my passenger, Serena, needs medical attention. She's been through hell." Alira's gaze shifted to Serena, her eyes narrowing as she took in the young woman's pallor and the faint glow of energy still lingering around her. "She's Valarian," Alira said flatly, her tone neutral but wary. "Half Valarian," James corrected, "and half human. The Council exiled her because of her mixed heritage and her abilities. They're hunting her down, and now they're after me too. We need your help." Alira studied them for a long moment before signaling her men. "Take them to the med bay. We'll discuss this further once your passenger is stabilized." Hours later, Serena lay in the Alliance's medical center, her color slowly returning as the doctors worked to stabilize her condition. James stood nearby, his arms crossed as he watched over her, relief flooding through him now that she was getting the care she needed. Commander Alira entered the room quietly, her sharp eyes focused on James. "She'll recover," she said, her voice softer now. "But it'll take time. Valarian physiology is complicated." James nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you." Alira crossed her arms, studying him closely. "You said the Council exiled her. Why?" James hesitated before answering. "They're afraid of what she could become. Her powers, they're beyond anything the Council can control, so instead of dealing with her they banished her to die in isolation." Alira's expression hardened. "That sounds like the Council, so why did you risk everything to save her?" James met her gaze, unflinching. "Because she deserves better, and because someone has to stand up to them." For a moment, Alira said nothing, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. Finally, she nodded. "You'll have your sanctuary here, Captain. But understand this, we're not your saviors. We're fighting our own war. If you want our protection, you'll need to contribute. That means missions, intel, anything we can use against the Council." James inclined his head in agreement. "That's fair." Alira turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "You've made powerful enemies, Captain. Be sure you're ready for what comes next." As she walked away, James glanced back at Serena, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest as she slept. They had found sanctuary, but he knew this was only the beginning. The Council wouldn't stop until they were both dead or captured. And now they had another war to fight. Days passed in relative quiet within the Zenith Alliance's base, but James could feel the mounting tension in the air. The rebellion against the Council was gaining momentum, and the Alliance's leadership was preparing for something big, something that would shake the balance of power in the galaxy. Serena recovered quickly, her strength returning along with her sense of purpose. The time spent resting had allowed her to reflect, and though the fear of her powers lingered, it was no longer crippling. She had come to accept that she couldn't run from who she was. Now she had to decide what to do with it. "You seem more at peace," James remarked one evening as they stood together on one of the outpost's observation decks, watching the distant stars. The hum of ships preparing for missions filled the background, but up here, it was quiet. Serena nodded, her violet eyes fixed on the stars. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about not letting them define me. And you're right. I can't keep running from this. I have to use what I have. James smiled softly. It's not easy, but you don't have to do it alone. She turned to him, her gaze intense. No, I don't, and neither do you. The Council took so much from both of us, but we have a chance to fight back now. James raised an eyebrow. You're talking about joining the Alliance. Serena nodded. They need people like us, people who know what it's like to be hunted, to be cast aside. We can help them. James considered her words. The idea of openly joining the fight against the Council wasn't something he had fully embraced yet. He had spent so much of his life avoiding that kind of conflict, keeping his head down and focusing on survival. But now, with Serena beside him and the Council closing in, the idea of running forever felt hollow. You really think we can make a difference? He asked quietly. Serena's eyes sparkled with determination. I know we can. We've already survived more than most. We can do this, James. Together. James exhaled, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. But as he looked at Serena, standing strong and unafraid, he knew she was right. They had been given a second chance, and it was time to take control of their destiny. All right, he said, his voice firm. Let's do it. The next day, they met with Commander Alira in one of the Alliance's war rooms. Maps of Council-controlled sectors were displayed on holographic tables, and teams of strategists moved around the room, coordinating the next phases of their campaign. Alira greeted them with a nod, her expression businesslike. I hear you've decided to join our cause. James and Serena exchanged a glance before nodding. We're in, James said. Alira's eyes flickered with approval, but her tone remained sharp. Good. We could use people like you. The Council's grip on the galaxy is slipping, but they won't go down without a fight. We're planning a series of strikes against key Council outposts. It'll be dangerous, but if we can pull it off, we'll cripple their supply lines and weaken their control. Serena stepped forward, her voice steady. I want to be part of it. I can help. Alira studied her for a moment before nodding. I'm assigning you to our covert ops team. We'll need your abilities to disrupt their systems. As for you, Captain Hartwell, she said, turning to James, you'll be leading a strike team in one of the upcoming assaults. We'll need your experience in ship-to-ship combat. James felt a surge of adrenaline, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Understood. As they left the war room, James turned to Serena, a grin tugging at his lips. Looks like we're officially rebels now. Serena smiled back, a spark of excitement in her eyes. Feels good, doesn't it? James laughed softly, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. Yeah, it does. And for the first time since they had fled from the Council's grasp, they weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back. The rebellion had begun. The stars above Orion's belt glimmered like a sea of diamonds against the infinite blackness of space. But beneath their serene beauty, a storm was brewing. James Hartwell stood on the bridge of the Endeavor, now part of a fleet of Zenith Alliance ships, each one ready for the most pivotal battle in their rebellion against the Galactic Council. The air was charged with tension, every crew member's movements sharp and precise as they prepared for what was coming. All systems green, Serena reported from her station beside him, her violet eyes focused and determined. She had trained with the Alliance's covert ops team for weeks, her abilities honed and her confidence restored. Now, she was a force to be reckoned with, and James felt a surge of pride every time he saw her in action. Good, James replied, glancing out the viewport. The Council's fleet was massive, their ships forming a wall of steel and firepower in the distance. It would be an all-out assault, but the Alliance had something the Council didn't, determination born from years of oppression, and a secret weapon in Serena. The battle plan was straightforward but risky. The Alliance fleet, led by James and his team, would engage the Council forces head-on, creating a diversion. Meanwhile, Serena and a small strike team would infiltrate the Council's flagship, disabling its central command systems and throwing their fleet into chaos. James's calm crackled to life. It was Commander Alira's voice, steady and calm despite the impending battle. Hartwell, are you in position? Ready and waiting, James responded, his hands steady on the controls. He had faced his share of dangerous missions, but this one felt different. Everything was on the line. Good. The Council's forces are closing in. We need your team to make contact with their central fleet within the next 10 minutes. We'll hold them off as long as we can. Understood, James said. He glanced at Serena, who was already rising from her station, preparing for the next phase of the mission. Stay sharp out there, he said, his voice lower, more personal. Serena gave him a small smile, the weight of their journey together reflected in her eyes. I always do. As she turned to leave, James's heart clenched. They had been through so much, fugitives, outcasts, survivors, and now they were about to face their greatest challenge yet. But they weren't running anymore. They were fighting for something larger than themselves, something worth risking everything for. Serena and her team boarded a small, sleek shuttle designed for stealth. James watched as the shuttle detached from the Endeavour, slipping through the chaotic dance of ships and lasers toward the Council's flagship. Godspeed, he whispered, turning back to the battle at hand. The Endeavour launched into the thick of the fight, its weapons blazing as James led his fleet against the Council's vanguard. Explosions lit up the void, ships twisting and turning in a deadly ballet. The Council's forces were overwhelming, but the Alliance fought with a ferocity that caught even the seasoned Council commanders off guard. Focus fire on their lead ships, James barked over the comm, his voice sharp with command. His crew responded instantly, the Endeavour weaving through the chaos with practiced precision. But even as they gained ground, James's thoughts remained with Serena. She was out there, facing unimaginable danger, and he could only hope the plan was going as expected. Minutes ticked by like hours. The Council's fleet was formidable, but the Alliance's hit-and-run tactics were beginning to wear them down. Just as James felt the tide turning, a warning flashed on his console. Incoming, someone shouted. A massive Council warship appeared from the dark side of the moon, its cannons glowing with deadly energy. James barely had time to react before the first barrage hit, the Endeavour shuddering violently under the impact. Shields at critical, his tactical officer reported, panic edging into his voice. Divert all power to shields and weapons, James ordered, his hands flying over the controls. We need to take that ship down, or we're done for. The Endeavour roared as its engines surged, diving toward the massive warship in a desperate gambit. Lasers fired from all angles, lighting up the void in a storm of energy. James's heart raced as he guided the ship into the teeth of the battle, every move calculated, every second critical. And then, just when it seemed like they were about to be overwhelmed, Serena's voice crackled through the comm. James, we're in position. Relief flooded through him. Good, we're getting hammered out here. Give us one more minute. Serena said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. James gritted his teeth, pushing the Endeavour forward. The warship loomed ahead, its cannons charging for another deadly volley. But James wasn't about to give up. Not now. Come on, Serena, he whispered, his knuckles white as he gripped the controls. Suddenly, the Council's warship flickered, its cannons dimming. The fleet around them hesitated, their formations breaking as confusion rippled through their ranks. We've disabled their command systems, Serena reported, her voice triumphant. James let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Nice work, now let's finish this. With the Council's forces in disarray, the Alliance pressed the attack. One by one, the Council's ships fell, their movements disorganized without their central command. The tide of the battle had turned. James watched as the Council's flagship exploded in a brilliant burst of light, the shockwave rippling through the remaining ships. The war was far from over, but this battle, the Battle of Orion's Belt, was theirs. The aftermath of the battle was surreal. The Zenith Alliance had won a critical victory, crippling the Galactic Council's hold on the galaxy. But as James Hartwell stood on the deck of the Endeavour, staring out into the vastness of space, he couldn't shake the weight of everything that had happened. Serena stood beside him, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the stars. Her powers had been instrumental in the victory. But more than that, she had found her place. No longer just a fugitive or an exile, she was a symbol of hope for the entire galaxy. And James, he had found more than just a cause to fight for. He had found someone who made all the risks, all the battles, worth it. We did it, Serena said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and disbelief. We actually did it. James smiled, his heart swelling with pride. We did, and we're just getting started. The Alliance's victory had shaken the galaxy, but the fight wasn't over. The Council was wounded but not defeated, and the real work of rebuilding a free galaxy had just begun. But for the first time in years, James felt a sense of hope. Real hope. What happens now? Serena asked, turning to him. Her violet eyes held a vulnerability that he hadn't seen since the day he found her on that desolate moon. James shrugged, his smile widening. Now, we keep fighting, but not just to survive. We fight to build something better. Serena's gaze softened, and she reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. Together? James met her eyes, his voice filled with quiet certainty. Together. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the future pressing in around them. But it wasn't a burden, it was a promise. A promise of the life they could build, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been cast aside by the powers that be. The stars twinkled above them, vast and endless, like a new beginning stretching out before them. Do you ever think about Earth? Serena asked, her voice contemplative. About going back? James tilted his head, considering the question. Earth felt like a distant memory, a place he had once called home but had long since left behind. His home was here now, among the stars, with I used to, he admitted. But not anymore. The galaxy's too big, too full of possibilities to go back now. Serena smiled, her eyes sparkling with that same sense of adventure that had drawn him to her in the first place. Then let's see it all. James squeezed her hand, his heart light. We will. Every last corner of it. Together, they watched the stars in silence, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. The battle for the galaxy wasn't over, but for the first time, James felt ready for whatever came next. Because no matter what happened, they would face it together. And in the vastness of space, anything was possible. The stars of tomorrow were theirs to claim.